Mabinogi in 2025. Now, if you don't know, every year we do this series where we take a look at the game, see where the game's headed, what's coming up for the game, and where the game's at, and kind of rank it compared to previous years. So we look at the gameplay, the storyline, upcoming content, new content that came out in the last year, and just see, is it worth your time? Is it worth playing? Should you dive into Mabinogi now? Well, stick around because we got all the answers for that in this video. So first up, we're going to talk about Mabinogi's gameplay loop. Now we're going to talk about two sides of the coin when it comes to this regard, because if you're new to the game, early game to mid game Mabinogi is wonderful. There's tons of things to do, tons of progression to have, and it's really fun and rewarding for this part of the game. What you're going to do early to mid game is run dungeons, and these are randomly generated rooms that will have a different layout every time you go into them. And there's like tons of these dungeons, varying types of monsters and difficulties. It's really fun when you're new to the game. Now, additionally, there's also shadow missions. Those are really fun. And this is where you're gonna honestly be spending most of your time as a new player, as well as the story missions, because those are crucial to unlocking new things. Unfortunately, some skills are locked behind the storyline. So if you're new to the game, make sure you do your story quest. Now for early to mid game, I would easily give this part of the gameplay a solid 8 out of 10. For new players, Mabinogi really has streamlined the early to mid game, making skills easier to rank up, which you'll be spending a lot of time doing. Streamlining the generations, so your story quests, they made those a lot easier as well. And they've also added this quest line that will bump you up to total level 20,000. And personally, to me, a lot of the fun is the grind of Mabinogi. You have to accept, like, okay, I'm not gonna get all this done in a week, but I can make a good dent in it. And that's why I give early game a solid 8 out of 10, okay? It's phenomenal. It's where I've had the most fun. But we have to talk about gameplay for endgame. Now, the endgame in Mabinogi can be very, very decisive depending who you ask. Some people are okay with it, some people hate it, and personally, I'm torn. So I'm gonna personally talk about my experience in endgame, and then talk about other people's experiences, so that way you get both sides of the coin, okay? So the reason why I enjoy the endgame is because I personally have a goal. My goal is to make the rarest sword in the game, so every time I log in, I'm chasing that dream. And to do that, the easiest way is to do endgame content and make money from that. So once you hit endgame, you're gonna be squeezing every possible revenue for additional damage, additional stats, and that's what I've been doing, and I've been loving it. My goal is to get stronger so I can do the content that I need to make this legendary sword easier. And I personally have the state of mind of like, okay, I'm not gonna get stronger within a week, 2 weeks. It's a slow grind for me, and I've accepted that, and I have fun doing it. If I get to play Mabinogi, it's typically a couple hours every other day, or when I'm streaming it. And this kind of informs how I feel about endgame, because with only a couple hours to play every other day, this dictates how I experience endgame. So personally for me, I would give it, still a solid 8 out of 10. The only downsides to this is that there's not enough endgame dungeons yet, and this kind of feeds into why some people who have more time to play hate endgame. With only a handful of dungeons, and some of them having weekly limit runs on them, people absolutely hate this. So while I might think gameplay wise across the board is a solid 8 out of 10, endgame players might think less of it, and that's completely justified. But with the weekly runs in place to play devil's advocate here, it gives you time to run other stuff and work on other things as well. Mabinogi's coming up on being 17 years old in North America. And with that comes a lot of content, which is kind of hard to sum up in a 10 to 15 minute long video. To me, much like Final Fantasy XIV, one of Mabinogi's strongest suits is the storyline. If you're ever not sure what to do, you can always fall back on doing one of its story quests. And Mabinogi has tons of these, okay? For Final Fantasy XIV, each new storyline gets added in an expansion. For Mabinogi, these get added in generations. And right now there is roughly 26 generations. Maybe it's the nostalgia in me, since I played since closed beta, but Mabinogi's earliest generations are some of the strongest ones. It has a compelling storyline that explains this world to you and has great characters that kind of drive the narrative forward. And it's something that you only get to experience once, and there's a few moments where I was like, holy shit, no way this person is this, no way this person did that, and it just blew my mind. Now, unfortunately, halfway through the generations, like the 10s and whatnot, it kind of falls off a little bit. They try and do some experimental things, and to me, it just didn't hit the mark. Now, since storyline is such a great thing to get invested in, I'm not going to spoil any of that here, but as a whole, from Generation 1 up until about Generation 20, I'm going to give the storyline a solid 6 rating, and that's because Generation 1 to 3, extremely solid, even up to 9, okay? All of that is so good. But for a little bit in the teens, it starts to fall off, and that's what unfortunately tanks the score a little bit lower. However, in the 20s, when Mabinogi becomes old enough to drink, in terms of storyline anyways, I think that's where it starts to get its shine again, and it becomes something truly interesting. The world is in your hands, essentially. Somebody's trying to destroy it, and it's up to you to stop it. And they do this in a big scale, in a very interesting and compelling way. Especially with the new generation, Generation 26, they tried to blend what they're doing currently in the storyline with some of the early on, like Generation 1, 2, 3. It has that same energy, and I love it. However, there is definitely some bullshit minigames sprinkled in there. So unfortunately, that is why I'm gonna give the new generations a 7. So a brief recap. Early Mabinogi has a great storyline, great writing, compelling characters, and it's just a once-in-a-lifetime experience. But when the storylines become a teenager, Mabinogi kind of loses its way in telling a compelling story and tried some experimental things that I don't know, it missed the mark. It felt weird. But when they bounce back in their 20, 21, 22, that's when Mabinogi really starts to find its groove again and gives us more compelling characters, an interesting storyline, higher stakes, and overall as a whole, Mabinogi does have a solid chunk of story content for you to dive in, and there's a lot for everyone. They tried to give you a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of the gabagool, you know? So if you were thinking about returning to Mabinogi, or even potentially starting, and you were scared, you're like, why would I sink all this time into it if it's just gonna die? It's an old game. It looks dated. Well, Mabinogi has a bright future ahead of it, and because of how big it is in Korea, we actually get a look at these events that go on there that showcase upcoming content, upcoming changes, and it's phenomenal. So we're getting a bunch of new classes soon. It just looks great. A bunch of new arcanas, a bunch of new weapons, a bunch of new areas, new dungeons to run. So if you were worried about, endgame being stuck where it is or the game not growing, boy, let me tell you something. It's growing. The amount of support that this game still gets for being so old is absolutely phenomenal. From support from our local North American community managers, they do an amazing job at doing live streams, giving us updates, but as well as in Korea, they're still supporting this game like it's the only game they own. Tons of quality of life changes, tons of updates, tons of events in the game. I don't think there's a single period of time where you could log into the game and not at least one event is running. Sometimes there's two, sometimes on rare occasions, there's 3 events going on at once. So in terms of staying power and support that this game is getting, I would definitely give it a 10 out of 10, especially if you were scared of jumping into it. There's no better time. For years, everyone thought Mabinogi was going to die, but with how the team has been handling the game, there is no chance that's going to happen, especially with the Unreal Engine update coming really soon. They keep showing amazing progress every couple months. It's a breath of new life for Mabinogi. So as a new or returning player, I would definitely recommend jumping into this game. We had a phenomenal year with even an IRL event in North America, which is crazy for Mabinogi considering it's so small, but everything indicates that this game's growing in a great way, especially with all the updates we get. It's just truly a great time to jump into Mabinogi. But to talk a little bit of downsides, the end game is where the game starts to suffer, and that's because of low drop rates, weekly run limits, and as well as abysmal RNG. And a lot of people think that this pushes you to spending real money on the game, so that way you don't have to grind it out. While they're not entirely wrong, it does kind of feel like that sometimes. If you're okay with grinding and just having fun and enjoying the game for what it is, you can stay free to play completely. But yeah, those are just my thoughts on Mabinogi going into 2025 and looking at the roadmap ahead. Overall, the game's in a solid place. It has a bright future ahead, and I'd love to hear what you think about Mabinogi. When it comes to making these videos, there's so much to cover and just not enough time unless you guys wanted to sit through an hour-long video. But in Mabinogi in 2024, everyone put up a great discussion in the comments talking about some of the pros and cons that I might have missed. Again, there's just so much content to come over, but moving forward, Mabinogi does look like it's in a good place, and I highly recommend checking it out. Well, with that, guys, looking into what we have going into 2025, I hope you guys all have a great year, and I'll see you again in 2026.